there, my name is Dr. Dorothy Buchli, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this video. So today we are going to begin our discussion of memory, right? Every time I talk about memory, I start with this question, what is memory? And I actually do that very intentionally because if I were to ask you to give me evidence that a memory has been made, okay? So if I were to ask you to put your scientist hat on, and I were to ask you, give me an example of scientific evidence that suggests that a memory has been created, right? Well, I pose that particular question because as college students, you guys are kind of a prime example of how we scientifically study memory, right? Everybody who is involved in academia or everyone who sets foot in a classroom, whether that's physically in a brick and mortar building or even online classes, everybody who is a student has demonstrated using scientific precision, okay, that they have learned something. So y'all actually already have quite a bit of experience investigating memory. Okay, so let's talk about, as always, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson here. Let's talk about the way that philosophers and scientists alike have attempted to understand memory. Well, like a lot of things in science, one of the most powerful devices that we have to support our understanding is the use of metaphors, right? So I don't mean to take you guys back to English class, right? I'm not going to talk about the difference between metaphors and similes or anything like that. But we all use metaphors very adeptly in our real life to aid our understanding, right? So for example, we use the solar system, okay, and the dynamics of Earth revolving around the sun and such to understand how subatomic particles work, right? So metaphors can be a very powerful device. And we've already talked about one very effective metaphor when we talked about the origins of cognitive psychology, right? During the cognitive revolution, we used the computer as a metaphor for the mind, and that gave rise to information processing models, right? Interestingly, when we talk about memory, we can't just isolate or restrict ourselves to a single metaphor. And the reason for that is there's really no such thing as human memory, but rather a collection of mechanisms that make up many different kinds of memories, right? So each of the metaphors listed here is actually very apropos for particular features of the memory system. So by the way, this table is in a very famous paper published by Dr. Henry Roediger, okay, who's a very famous, very accomplished memory scientist. And so he reviewed the literature, kind of scoured all of the writings about human memory, starting very, very early in the days of antiquity, the philosophers, all the way to when the paper was published in 1980. Right. So I want you to just take a cursory glance here to kind of see what we're looking at, right? So Plato and Aristotle had a number of really sophisticated metaphors for memory. So when talking about memory for one's own experiences, both Plato and Aristotle likened memory to a wax tablet, right? So we all have a wax tablet in our minds that helps us to absorb and create memories of our experiences. But there's individual differences in the extent to which our wax, if you will, our wax tablet absorbs those experiences, right? So for some people, their experiences imprint on their mind very firmly, okay? And a lasting mold is created. Whereas other people, their memories are fleeting, and so those imprints are kind of surface level, right? So that kind of talks about how we create memories of our own experiences. And Aristotle also, or Plato, excuse me, also said that a memory is like an aviary, right? So an aviary is just a giant cage full of birds, like something you would experience at the zoo, for example. And so Plato said, once we've created an imprint of our experience, that mental representation lives in a virtual cage with all of our other experiences. And sometimes when memory recall is successful, it's just like if we were to reach out our hand, stick our finger out, and call to a bird, maybe whistle. Okay, I can't whistle, so I'm not going to pretend to do that for you. But we hold out our hand, we outstretch our finger, and in flies the bird that we call exactly as we remember, right? So the right bird comes at the right time, and that's a successful recall. Times we get a similar looking bird, okay? But not quite the bird or not quite the memory that we're looking for, okay? So we're trying to remember the word table, and we keep thinking of the word chair. Okay, that's an example of a particular type of semantic memory intrusion, right? So intrusions or interference is when one memory displaces another memory. Okay, so Plato talked about that very compellingly with his aviary metaphor, right? So we forget things because some of our memories are displaced by other memories. That's perfectly captured in the aviary metaphor. And then maybe some of the other metaphors seem kind of intuitive, right? Like a lot of people think that memory works like a video camera or a tape recorder, right? So I'll give you some very compelling examples that illustrate why that particular analogy has now been demonstrated to be inaccurate, right? But at least it's intuitive, right? But then we also have some weird ones, like memory is like a garbage can, memory is like a subway map, memory is like a switchboard, memory is like an acid bath, okay? Memory is like a cow's stomach, memory is like a gramophone, right? So they seem very random, but again, what this is meant to illustrate is just how complex and multifaceted our memory system can be. Okay, so here's a much more satisfying definition of memory for you that you can commit to memory. So memory can be said to include processes involved in retaining, okay? And just like when we talked about um, social learning theory and Bandura, right? Retention or retaining just means holding on to something, right? So in a medical context, if you have water retention, it means your whole body, your tissues are holding on to water, so you have water weight, right? So retention or retaining is just storing memories. So we know that there are multiple mechanisms in the brain for creating and storing memories. Basically, our memories are created by the hippocampus, and then they're stored in surrounding areas called the neocortex. So we'll talk about that. But one process that includes one of the memory related processes is retaining information. And then, of course, we have retrieving information. So not only storing information, but being able to access it later. So going back to the aviary metaphor, right? Being able to call to a particular bird and have it be recalled. Using and manipulating our memory, right? So anytime we've conjured up a mental map, just like Tolman's rats, or anytime that we do mathematical, anytime we do math in our head, like to calculate a tip, or anytime we're playing chess and we imagine what our opponent's next move is going to be, right? That's using and manipulating information. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about working memory. Okay? But all of these processes constitute memory. And specifically, we retain, retrieve, use, and manipulate information when it is no longer present. Right? So remember, one of the key functions of the mind or of consciousness is to create mental representation of experiences and objects in our environment so that we can operate upon them later, right? So memory are all of the processes that allow us to operate and store information when it's no longer physically present in our environment. Okay, so information that we use our memory processes on can include stimuli like images and pictures and words like letters, numbers. It can include events or experiences in our life, things that we've gone through. It can include ideas, so creative innovations or music, okay, that we create, and skills. It can include, I just talked about music, and it can include music, art, it can include skills like riding a bike, okay, or tying your shoes or playing the piano. So we say that memory is active anytime some past experience has an impact on how you think or behave now or in the future. So I'll say that again. Anytime a past experience impacts how you think or behave, either in the present or in the future, right? So another kind of underappreciated example of memory is something called priming, right? So we've all had the experience, right, of sitting, in front of the television, kind of half paying attention, right? And we see a commercial for pizza, okay? And maybe there's a jingle or something, or a little cartoon man eating a pizza, okay? And we're half paying attention to that. But then 2 days later, when we have to decide where we want to go out to eat, we might think, oh, pizza sounds good, right? So that is the way that advertising kind of capitalizes on priming, right? So anytime a commercial or an advertisement predicts or controls our future behavior, even when that commercial is no longer on, right? That's an indication of memory. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about in this little clip before you get to your other videos for today, I'm going to talk about the different types of memory, right? So I mentioned there are a collection of different types of memory that make up human cognition. Okay, so I'm going to use kind of this cheesy example. Okay, so let's say that this woman in the picture, her name is Pam, and on March 30th, 1986, Pam goes to a fireworks show. Okay, and while she's sitting on a blanket watching the fireworks. Suddenly, she sees a beautiful fireworks display. Okay, all of the beautiful lights and colors. And while she's looking at the fireworks, suddenly she sees for the first time ever Jim's face. Okay, and you guys know I'm sure it's very obvious what reference I'm making here. It's kind of a dated reference, but so be it, right? So when Pam closes her eyes for a millisecond, even though her eyes are closed, she can still see in her mind's eye those beautiful fireworks and an image of Jim's face, right? And that image is seared into her mind's eye for a very, very brief period of time, okay? It's almost like a mental snapshot, like her brain stopped and had its picture taken, right? So that very, very brief, fleeting memory for what Pam saw, okay, is called sensory memory. Right? So sensory memory is a brief snapshot of whatever's coming in through our senses, whether that's our eyes or our ears or even touch. Okay, so that's sensory memory. So after she sees Jim, okay, Pam starts talking to Jim and they have a wonderful conversation. It's a very, engaging conversation, and she can tell right away that she really likes Jim. Okay. So remember, this is a bit of a walk through time, if you will, because this is 1986, so there are no cell phones, right? There are no cell phones or TikTok or anything like that. So at the end of the night, Jim gives Pam her phone number, or his phone number, right? So in order for Pam to remember that phone number and keep it in her memory, right, she has to rehearse it. So she says to herself over and over and over, 421-5008, 421-5008, okay? And that process of keeping information that you're consciously thinking about, okay, or of holding information that you're consciously thinking about temporarily is known as short-term memory. Short-term memory. And the way that Pam keeps this information in her short-term memory is through a process called rehearsal, where she says the information to herself over and over again in a loop. So then Pam gets home, writes the number down, and she and Jim have a wonderful first year of dating before they decide to get married on the same day they met, March 30th. Okay? So now Pam not only has sensory and short-term, previous sensory and short-term memories of Jim, she now has long-term memories as well. So there are 3 types of long-term memories. When it comes to skills and motor memories, okay, so riding a bike, for example, okay, that is a procedural memory. So riding a bike or kicking a soccer ball or tying your shoes, okay, playing a piano, those would all fall under procedural memories. Episodic memories are kind of autobiographical memories or memories for particular events or episodes in your life. So Pam's memory of her first date with Jim, where they rode their bicycles to a park and had a picnic, okay, that would be episodic memories. So long-term memories for events and experiences. So for example, your memory for when your parents dropped you off at Mercer for the first time. or your memory of meeting your first psychology professor, right? Those would be episodic memories. And finally, we have semantic memories. So semantic memories are long-term memories that basically include facts and general knowledge about the world, right? So being able to count to 10 or 100 or 1,000, right? That would fall under semantic memory. Knowing that the capital of Georgia is Atlanta and that our governor is Brian Kemp and the president is Donald Trump, right? Those would be semantic memories or world knowledge, right? Or Pam's memory that she met Jim for the first time on March 30th, 1986. That would be a semantic memory. Now, just to illustrate the difference between long-term semantic memories and long-term episodic memories, okay, Pam's memory that she got married on March 30th, okay, is a semantic memory because it's just a date. It's just a fact. Whereas her memory for the day that she got married, the dress she was wearing, the speech that her dad made, the taste of the cake, right? All of that would fall under episodic memory. Interestingly enough, a lot of our long-term memories start out as episodic memories and gradually become more semanticized over time. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose I were to ask Jason at the age of 8 what the capital of Georgia is. Right? Well, at the age of 8, that puts Jason in 3rd grade. In most states, they start to teach kids about geography and state capitals in 3rd grade. So when I ask Jason what is the capital of Atlanta, or what is the capital of Georgia, he's going to say Atlanta. But chances are when he retrieves that information, he's going to recall sitting in his class on a Wednesday with Mrs. Smith wearing a dress with a skirt that looks like a map, okay, and drawing a picture of the United States, and then reading or watching videos about the imports and exports of each state, and maybe learning a song with all the state capitals and winning a prize, right? So because Jason is only 8 years old, he still has a richly detailed episodic memory of where he was and what he was doing when he learned that Atlanta was the capital of Georgia. As opposed to asking Ryan, who's 29, what the capital of Georgia is, right? Ryan learned the state capitals more than 20 years ago. Okay, so that episodic memory has become of learning the state capitals in childhood has become fundamentally stripped from all of that episodic or incidental information about the actual episode, and now it just exists kind of as a fact. Okay, so hopefully this video was helpful. You're welcome to reach out if you have any questions. And next up, you will learn about the modal model of memory and sensory memory. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.